Out of Control. This is the theme for the GMTK Game Jam 2020, which challenged game developers from all over the world to embark in a 48-hour game-making competition. This jam was hosted by the mega-popular video game analysis channel here on YouTube called Game Maker's Toolkit. The goal? Make a playable game in a weekend that in some way embodied the theme out of control. But out of control what? Movement? Enemies? Bullets? That part's up to you. Now, the GMTK Game Jam isn't just any game jam. No, it is the game jam, hosted by one of the biggest game development channels on YouTube. There were over 5,000 submissions in the 2020 competition, over doubling the submissions from last year and making it the largest jam once again in its history. Suffice to say, I had a lot of competition. But the thing is, I wasn't originally going to participate. See, I'm currently working on my own game project in Unity, and while developing that full time, I thought I didn't have the time to make a whole game in a weekend. But that project's been feeling kind of stale recently. So I decided at the last minute that this jam would be the perfect opportunity to get my creative juices flowing again and join the dev community in our biggest event of the year. So with an hour left to spare, I decided to buckle up and hit start. Hey, this is KalechippsDev, and this is the making of my submission to the GMTK 2020 Game Jam, Mission Control. So a little background. I live in the US, but the jam is hosted in England, so for me, the jam lasted from Friday at 3 p.m. until Sunday at 3 p.m. Factoring in time for sleeping, eating, and exercising, as well as the summer internship that I'm working on, this left not a lot of time at all for game development. This is going to be a time crunch. But what to make of the theme Out of Control? Maybe I could make a platformer where different orbs would change the player's controls. Different orbs would reverse controls, reverse gravity, or make you super fast or super slow. Maybe I could make an old school arcade game reminiscent of Space Invaders or Galaga, the kind of game where your spaceship moves from left to right at the bottom of the screen, and suddenly your spaceship goes out of control and you can fly all over the level, shooting up aliens from all different angles. But none of these ideas stuck, and honestly, I thought they felt a little basic. But then I had an idea. What if I interpreted the theme figuratively? See, the jam doesn't put any limits on how you interpret the theme. I thought, what if you played as a person whose life is out of control, and you have to navigate the tricky parts of everyday life? Which, let's be honest, everyday life feels kind of out of control recently. What if I could use the theme to tell a story about feeling out of control? Thus was born the idea for Mission Control. I wanted to use this jam to practice telling a story through games, which I think is one of the most powerful and interesting things that a video game can do. And while making a game like that for a game jam is sort of non-traditional, I thought that this would be the perfect opportunity to go a little outside the box and make something that I really wanted to make, not just something that had been done before. So I was going to make a story game. I immediately thought about creating a game about a mission control center, just another short plug of the jam's theme, calling it Mission Control. The game would be about a control officer named Colt in a futuristic world where space travel is commonplace, and you'd have to navigate an ordinary maintenance call that goes out of control and becomes much more serious. Telling the story would be a task that would stretch all parts of my development mind. Creating a story in a game is a process that takes design sensibility, not to mention powerful writing, captivating art, and of course, a lot of code. And moreover, I was making a project that was pretty unconventional for a jam game. There were no traditional game elements, but I still had to make it fun and engaging. How do you do that? This is a challenge that I was up for though, so on day one, I got started making my jam game. Day one was all about art. If you've been following my channel, you know that I've been working at getting better at game art recently. And even though the jam rules allowed you to use outside assets, I wanted to add to the challenge of this jam by making all of the art for it as well. So the evening of day one, I tried my hand at creating a short mock-up for the art. The idea originally was that this would be a simple placeholder asset that I could use to start coding, so I didn't put much thought into it. But once I started, I really fell in love with this low poly art style. So I decided to just run with it, and spent all of that first evening creating an environment where the game would take place. A cramped and dark mission control booth in the middle of the night where Colt suddenly receives a distress call. Now, after getting carried away, the art is all I finished on the first day. But I was really happy that I spent time giving the environment the attention it deserved, since that is really the backbone to telling a story. And since I started at 3 p.m, I wasn't too torn up about only getting the art done on the first day. Now, day two was completely different. This was grind time. Day two of the jam was nothing like day one. I had to finish basically all of the game's underlying mechanics so that I would leave time on day 3 to write the story and upload it to itch. Mechanics-wise, the core of a story game is the text box at the bottom. This is the hub of everything that the player interacts with for the entire story, and it's just a box with some text in it, so that makes it pretty simple code-wise, right? Well, not really. Dialogue is surprisingly complex. For each line of dialogue, there's actually a lot more information than just the text. For example, who's speaking? What do they look like? What's their name? What do they sound like? How do I display stylized text, like italics in different colors? I ended up storing all this information in a dialogue object. This is infinitely customizable, so I can swap out different images, names, and text, and speech effects pretty easily. That's pretty important for a story game since the system needs to support lots of different people talking to each other. After hooking up that system, it looked like this. But then I ran into a bug when trying to type out the stylized text. That was the stuff like italics and colored text. Under the hood, this text is tagged with different markers that tell what style the text should be in. But once the text was being typed out, the tags were actually being displayed. So I had to take some time to write short code to skip over the tags. Then I decided that it felt a little bit tedious having to read through all the text, and some people read faster than others, so I added an option to skip to the end of the text by clicking. You can either wait and read the text as it appears, or you can click to display the entire text instantly. This is a pretty conventional feature for a dialogue system. The text was still feeling kind of bland though, so I added a sound effect when people talk, which only plays when letters are typed, not for spaces and punctuation. That's actually a pretty important distinction, I think. I use this tool called BFXR, which is very popular for game jams, to create different speech sounds, so each character has a different sound effect. And finally, I added small pauses in the typing at commas and punctuation. These are really small details, but I wanted the dialogue to feel as close to natural speech as possible, since I was trying to create a sense of realism in the story. The things that make a story game good, in my opinion, are things like realism and emotion. Again, kind of different from making a typical video game, but they're both concerned with creating a valuable, coherent experience. Finally, I added a way to add different responses to dialogue. This really makes the story come alive, since now you could respond to the story and shape its progression. Each dialogue line has a pointer to the next dialogue line in a data structure called a linked list, and the response that you pick modifies the path of that linked list. With these simple rules, it's possible to create complex storylines that depend on different response patterns. And I could have stopped here because at this point I had a pretty full-featured dialogue system, but even with the speech system feeling pretty good, the game still felt kind of bland. You were just reading a story basically, with response options every now and then, and I started thinking about how to make the story feel more alive, again thinking about realism. That's when I had the idea to create a notepad, where you could write down things that were being said to you and use that evidence to answer questions later in the story. Something about this made mission control feel so much more real. You weren't just an outsider reading a story anymore. You were a real person helping someone through a crisis, writing down information that was important to alert emergency responders. And with these final changes in, the speech system was feeling pretty awesome if I do say so myself. I went to bed happy that on day 3 I would only have to write the story and publish. Plenty of time to do that, right? Alright, with the jam ending at 3 o'clock on Sunday, I woke up with not a lot of time left to write the story, add it to the game, test, and submit. So naturally I decided not to waste any time and get started writing right away. Yeah, no, instead I spent a good 2 hours researching post-processing to create this super fancy screen that flickers. Yeah, at this point the game was doomed to be submitted late. I didn't start writing the story until about 4 hours before the deadline, and the process of writing itself took one of those 4 hours, so I had 3 hours left to test and submit. I ended up with a story about a mission control officer named Colt who has to navigate a situation that quickly goes out of control when the call center receives a distress signal. The story is about Colt talking to a young pilot who has just crashed his ship and is quickly running out of oxygen. It becomes a story about reconciling with the parts of life that are out of our control, but also taking agency over the parts of our life that we do control. But I realized that the work of converting that Google Doc into a linked list in Unity was going to take a lot longer than I expected. See, each dialogue had to be tagged with who spoke, what the possible responses were, and what the next dialogue should be based on which response was chosen. Here's where things went from bad to worse. See, getting your game from Unity to browser isn't as simple as uploading the project file. You have to do what's called build your Unity project, which is large and has a bunch of editor-specific features into a lighter version that's compatible with the web. This is a large and clunky process, and it takes a long time. So in the last half hour of the jam, I only had time to build once. So I built as fast as possible and held my breath as I uploaded the project with literally 7 seconds to spare, and it was broken. See, the UI elements scaled differently with screen size, and I had never had the chance to test it in browser beforehand, so the dialog box, the whole purpose of the game, was off screen. Worse, the responses were hidden entirely, so you weren't actually able to play through the story, you just got stuck when you ran into dialogue responses. I was devastated that after a whole weekend of work, the game wasn't playable past the first few lines. I rebuilt the project with the correct UI settings as quick as I could, but since it takes so long, it was already past the deadline. No one would see it, no one would rate. And worst of all, I missed out on participating in the biggest game jam of the year with the entire dev community. This sucked. While I mourned the loss of my project, I remembered how last jam, there was a grace period for late submissions, since itch crashed due to the sheer size of the GMTK Game Jam.
In fact, it was so big that it temporarily crashed the site's servers.
I googled GMTK Twitter as fast as I can, and voila, my redemption. There was a 30-minute grace period for late jam submissions. All I had to do was email my link and a reason. Now, I wasn't sure that my appeal would be granted. Ultimately, it was my fault and my fault alone for not allocating more time for submitting, which I knew would be a time crunch, but all I could do was wait. So I waited a few hours past the deadline and received a ping in my email. The appeal was accepted, and the game was submitted. All my work for the past weekend would at least reach the eyes of some fellow jam members. Now, I'm pretty happy with the project overall. The final version is a little buggy, the UI elements didn't scale perfectly, but at least they're visible, and it felt good to take a break from my longer project and finish something in a weekend. Most importantly, I can actually use the dialogue system that I developed for Mission Control in my actual game. The game was a pretty new direction for me, but I'm proud of the short story I was able to write. Mission Control is now playable on itch.io, linked in the description, so you can experience it for yourself. If you do, leave a comment about what you thought. I talked about the premise for it, but I really think it's something you have to experience playing through yourself to get the full experience. So after 48 long hours, my game was submitted, accepted, and I'd successfully reinvigorated my excitement about my own game. It was certainly a roller coaster completing this jam after deciding to enter an hour before it started, but I'm proud of the game that I was able to create. The game jam process is a lot of pressure, but it's honestly so satisfying to see a whole game start and end in a single weekend, and I cannot recommend it enough to all of you if you have never done a game jam before. Anyway, once again, this is KaleChips, and this has been the making of Mission Control. If you want to support me, make sure to do all that YouTube stuff, like, comment, subscribe. You know the deal. See you soon. Thanks, y'all.